Good morning and welcome to my final project presentation, Seattle Crime Data, K-means Cluster Analysis. So the data I selected represents crime reported to the Seattle Police Department from about mid-March to May 2019, so just a few months' time. However, in that time, about 6,500 events were reported or detected by the Seattle Police Department. Now, the data was collected by a government agency, so I didn't really have to do much data cleaning. Um, it was completely ready to go. I selected this topic and this data because I do hold a minor in criminal studies, and I was kind of interested how these different analyses we've been practicing in class could be used to detect crime and where it may be in the future. And I'm sure that that is being used currently, but of course it's fun to test it yourself. So that's what I did. Here's the data dictionary. I won't read the entire thing for you, but I want to point out the few areas I focused on. So the crime subcategory, this is an offense categorization categorized by the FBI. The reason this was important to the analysis is because it made sure that any descriptions officers were giving in this category were based off of a preconceived list and definition, meaning that if a officer said assault, everyone knows what that means, and when I report my findings later, assault rates are higher in this section. We're not wondering what assault is. It's already defined for us. However, we did see some discrepancy in the next section here, the primary offense description. Officers were given more leeway to describe the crime in this area, and so we get some discrepancies, such as the word car and vehicle being used, and we saw that a little bit in the data. We'll check that out later. The other two areas I used were precinct, the 5 geographical areas of Seattle. I didn't really use the sector or the beat as much because those are really mostly just used for deploying police forces. They seem to get confused and mixed around if I tried to use them in the data. So I really focused on precinct and neighborhood, the unique neighborhood names that Seattle uses and their micro community policing plan were probably one of the most beneficial aspects of organizing the data. There's a sample of the original data. We're only going to use certain sections, as I mentioned, but you can see here we were given lots of numerical data as well. So I was able to use some of the techniques we learned in RapidMiner throughout the year to parse and choose my attributes, what I wanted to study. So my analysis goal was to try to determine if there was any correlation between specific crime subcategories and descriptions and locations, such as neighborhoods and precincts. I was really focusing on words and tokens, which I got to use during the analysis process, setting up my design, rather than numerical data. I settled on K-means clustering after trying out all 3 of the techniques. I felt like K-means was the most useful to me for 2 reasons. The first one, you could see here the cluster plot model. These large spikes were obviously immensely helpful in pointing out to me where I should start looking, where the patterns were strongest. I also chose it just because I believe it gave more flexibility over the numerous attributes compared to the other 2 analysis options. This was the largest data set, especially attribute-wise, that I attempted all year. And I felt much more comfortable with K-means, I think just because of the breakdown it allowed me. And as you can see by the definition here, I was able to control K, the amount of groups I wanted to break it into, which in my final process diagram, I settled on 10 clusters. I tried 4, I tried 7. I felt like 10 finally parsed apart some of the discrepancies we're gonna talk about and allowed the patterns to come out. So let's take a look. I'll present the most notable trends that I found throughout the K-means cluster analysis, but a couple things of note. The first one is there are some words to be aware of that are always going to show up together. So the token separators that I used in the final process diagram break apart the words aggravated and assault. However, according to the FBI requirements, those 2 words are always together. So an officer was never going to write out a description with the word aggravated that didn't also include assault. So we can kind of disregard that pattern. Some other examples of that are location names like South and Southwest. Since Southwest contains the word South, it was also showing up in some of my results. So I had to be careful and take that into consideration. And then the last one I'll point out too that we discussed earlier is discrepancies just in common verbiage. So some police officers were writing, break-ins to vehicle, and some were writing break-ins to car. So I kind of considered that when studying the patterns as well. So rather than derive assumptions from those connections, I tried to focus on words that I knew were not inherently connected to one another in any way, and just tried to see if it would show a pattern. All right, so the first most obvious pattern was in cluster 1, where we can see that the downtown and commercial neighborhoods of Seattle have the highest rates of really most of the reported crime options. Logically, if we step away from data and we were just making, an educated guess, this makes sense. Downtown commercial neighborhood has the highest population. It has the largest discrepancy between amount of officers and residents. So a higher rate in crime makes sense. And you would think that the Seattle Police Department's probably aware of this, but this analysis would be a good jumping off point to recommend that they focus in this area. My second assumption came with the crime category prowl. The word prowl means a suspicious person just basically being where they shouldn't. So either maybe it's a middle of the night or an area that's supposed to be private property, and somebody reported seeing a person that shouldn't be there. This was reported most highly in the North Precinct, as we can see in Cluster 8. The number was stronger than, much stronger than many of the other precincts, so I would probably recommend to the Seattle Police Department that they look into it, but it wasn't so strong that I wouldn't recommend some further analysis just to kind of confirm before we send off extra units in that direction per se. Another kind of logical based assumption that the data revealed to us is that burglaries occur highest in residential areas. We kind of associate the term burglary with home rather than, like a business. So this kind of makes sense. But there was such a strong correlation that I would probably want to look into other connections. Again, I wouldn't make any concrete recommendations to Seattle PD yet, but I would maybe then now is when I would go ahead and run the numerical analysis to see if we can get times of day or some other connections to go off of. But it is a helpful assumption. The last assumption I made was we can see here in the centroid table here that theft and trespass typically pretty much occur at the same rate. There's a few sections here where there are discrepancies. I found that most of those, and you can kind of see in the data miner set, happened when the cluster was being organized by crime word rather than area. But especially, cluster 0, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 5, we have numerous occurrences where they occur simultaneously. So what I would tell the Seattle Police Department based on this information is if someone is bold enough, comfortable enough, has the opportunity to trespass, it appears that they're also willing to steal. So if we can perhaps prevent or discourage the first crime, trespassing, then maybe we could bring down some of the theft rates in Seattle. So in conclusion, I believe the k-means clustering analysis provided some useful data connections for us. I don't feel like it really provided enough information to make wholesale policing changes or move a bunch of government money around. But I think that there were some trends that they would want to look at closer and analyze further to perhaps make changes. I really enjoyed the process of it. I thought it was really fun to manipulate this data in RapidMiner, kind of change some of the parameters and see the different patterns that ended up coming from that. So thank you for your time. I've learned a bunch in this course this semester. I've never done any data or text mining before, and I really appreciated the different assignments that you gave us and the technology, especially getting to hands-on explore with RapidMiner was phenomenal. I feel way more comfortable with that aspect now, and I appreciate your time and hope that you have a great rest of your semester.